Good morning, everyone. I'm Denora Gattacho. I am one of the commissioners of the Public Elections Campaign Finance Commission. Thank you for being with us this morning here in Albany on a beautiful day. I apologize that we're running a little bit behind. Some of us who had to come from downstate had a little bit of travel delays, so I apologize for that and for any delay related to that, how that impacts your day. Want to give all of the commissioners a chance to introduce themselves this morning so that you know who you are speaking with this morning before we get officially started. So I'll start on my right with Commissioner Kimberly Galvin.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Galvin. I was appointed by Minority Leader Brian Kolb from the New York State Assembly.
David Previtt, appointed by the Senate Minority, John Flanagan.
Jay Jacobs, appointed by Governor Cuomo.
Again, I'm Denora Gattacho, appointed by Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins.
And I'm John Nona, also appointed by Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins.
Rosanna Vargas, appointed by New York State Speaker Carl Hastie.
Crystal Rodriguez, also appointed by the House Speaker, Carl Hastie.
We also, go ahead. No, I just need the pen. We also have two commissioners who are unable to be with us today. Hopefully one, I believe they're watching us on live stream, so they will have an opportunity to hear your comments. Henry Berger, who was jointly appointed by the Majority Leader, the Speaker, and the Governor, and Mylan Dennerstein, appointed by Governor Cuomo. For those of you online, you probably are already on the website, but for those of you in the room, just want to reiterate the website is campaignfinancereform.ny.gov, where you can live stream and keep track of the hearings and the work of the commission over time. I know we have a healthy list of individuals who are ready to share their opinions and comments on the mighty task before us, so I want to make sure, without any further delay, that we get started this morning. Want to abide by the rules that we have put forth, that we will have 3 minutes for each speaker to be able to share their thoughts. We also have expert speakers this morning who will begin, and we have some elected officials who we also want to get on the docket. So I will do my best to make sure that we get to everybody in a timely manner and appreciate everybody's patience, and want to make sure that everybody in that room, because I heard a bunch of people say they couldn't hear, are able to hear. Yes? Yeah. Great. Thank you, and we'll make sure to that we, as well as the speakers, make use of the microphone so that everybody can hear. We're beginning first with the expert speakers. So first we have Peter, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing your last name, Lavinia from the Green Party. Are you here? Oh, there you are, sir. Please join us.
Members of the Campaign Finance Reform Commission, thank you for inviting me to appear during this hearing for expert testimony. I am the co-chair of the Green Party of New York, and I hold a PhD in political science from the University at Albany. For those unfamiliar, the Green Party is a political party based on 4 key values: grassroots democracy, social and economic justice, ecological wisdom, and nonviolence. The Green Party and its candidates have a long-standing rule refusing corporate and special interest donations. We have also chosen as an organization to reject the practice of electoral fusion, cross-endorsement, and opportunity to ballot that pervades New York State politics. We do this from a deeper understanding and desire for democratic government. But it is not difficult to see the ramifications of large private donors and cross-endorsements that have warped our political sphere in the interest of the wealthy and turned elections at all levels into a game of patronage. This commission has 2 important questions before it: enacting a system of public campaign financing and potentially banning the procedure known as electoral fusion. We believe these questions are interrelated with the larger question of how to improve democratic government in New York. The Green Party sees the purpose of public campaign financing as limiting the corrupting influence that private monies and special interests have on elected officials in government, increasing the competitiveness of elections, not just between the Democratic and Republican parties, but to allow smaller parties like the Greens as well as independent candidates a more level playing field, increasing diversity of candidates, and providing elected representatives and candidates increased time to interact with constituents rather than campaign donors. Recently, Governor Cuomo proposed a partial public campaign financing bill on the matching funds model, similar to that used by New York City. While it is commendable that New York State is finally serious about enacting a system of public campaign financing, the Green Party does not believe the matching funds model satisfies the purpose of public campaign financing as I have just described. And in fact, there are serious issues with both the proposal and matching funds themselves. There are unfortunately at least 4 major problems with the matching funds bill that was proposed by the governor during the last legislative session. 1, the matching funds are supplementary to unlimited private funding. Candidates that opt into the matching fund system would still be able to raise an unlimited amount of money from private donors to be supplemented by matching funds. The proposal does limit individual contributions, but the levels are still extraordinarily high: $12,000 for statewide candidates, $8,000 for state senate, and $4,000 for state assembly. Contrast this to the $2,800 limit for federal candidates. Is there any wonder that at least 28 New York State lawmakers have been forced to resign due to corruption charges since the year 2000? 2. The proposal still allows for backdoor funding of matching funds candidates from wealthy donors and PACs through party transfers. The current donation limits to a party committee are set at $62,500, which would have been lowered to $25,000 in the governor's proposal. The governor's proposal limited transfers to candidates to $5,000 on any given race per election cycle, with the caveat that they would also be permitted to transfer $500 per voter during a general or special election. This would again give undue advantage to candidates of major parties and incumbents funded primarily by the wealthy. 3. The threshold for matching funds qualification are far too high. For governor, $650,000 minimum to kick in with at least $6,500 matchable contributors between $10 and $175 from New York State residents. And this is similar for lieutenant governor and comptroller, which had a $200,000 minimum, state senator, which had a $20,000 minimum, and state assembly a $10,000 minimum. These thresholds make the proposed campaign finance system one that heavily benefits major party candidates and incumbents. Green Party candidates would be hard-pressed to qualify for any of these thresholds, especially as we do not accept corporate or special interest donations as a matter of principle. To give a further example, a major party candidate for state comptroller, Republican Bob Antonacci, tried and failed to qualify for matching funds under a one-year pilot program adopted for the 2014 election for state comptroller candidates. To qualify, Antonacci was required to raise at least $200,000, with at least 2,000 contributions of between $10 and $175. He raised about $225,000 in total, but not all of it was qualified for matching funds. 4. The matching funds model can multiply differences between candidates and funding. Let us suppose one assembly candidate raises a minimum $10,000 to qualify, and then with a 6-to-1 match as was proposed, gets $60,000 more in matching funds for a total of $70,000. Let us also suppose another assembly candidate raises $20,000 in qualified contributions and receives $120,000 more in matching funds for a total of $140,000. The matching funds system would change the funding in this race from a difference of $10,000 to a difference of $70,000 between the two candidates' funding. Candidates from an organization like the Green Party would find reaching the minimum threshold for assembly races extraordinarily difficult, let alone for Senate or statewide office. Even if a Green candidate barely crossed the qualification threshold, the differences between the Green candidate's funds and the major party candidate's funds would be multiplied sixfold by a public matching fund system ostensibly established to reduce inequities in funding. The Green Party believes partial public campaign matching fund systems, especially those currently proposed in New York State, are detrimental to third parties like the Greens, continue to allow for the dominance of private money in elections and its influence on government, and can multiply fundraising differences between electoral opponents. It is likely that without an extraordinarily low threshold for matching funds and a ban on private fundraising after opting in, a matching fund system would not benefit small parties like the Greens or even challengers to well-connected incumbents. Thankfully, there is another model of public campaign financing that exists that addresses these issues, usually called Clean Money, Clean Elections, which is a grants-based system of full public campaign financing for candidates. The Green Party supports the Clean Money, Clean Elections grants-based model of full public campaign financing because it is the only system in the United States that has been consistently proven to meet the goal of increasing competitiveness of elections, limiting the influence of private monies, and creating a more level playing field for all parties and candidates. There is a wealth of evidence for these conclusions from Arizona and Maine, and to an extent Connecticut, the three states where a Clean Money, Clean Elections system of full public campaign financing has been enacted. There are 8 reasons why the Green Party supports this type of full public campaign financing system. 1. It eliminates private campaign funding for those that opt into this voluntary system. Matching funds programs do not eliminate private campaign funding, but act as public supplements to private donations. This is problematic as it means private donors can still influence campaigns and elected officials. While matching fund systems may increase the amount of small donor participation, it is not the case that small donor participation is equivalent to democratic, fair, and equal elections. Money should not equal free speech. Statistics from New York City's elections also show that large donors still have a major impact even with matching funds. Astoria City Limits in 2017 show that half of the donations to Mayor de Blasio's campaign came from people contributing the $4,950 maximum. Overall, 72% of the donations in the 2017 election cycle in New York City came from donors giving $1,000 or more. With a grants-based Clean Money, Clean Election system, candidates that choose to opt in also agree to cease private fundraising in exchange for grants that are set to levels that allow for a competitive campaign for the office sought. This means candidates for office would receive the same amount and compete on a more level playing field, making elections fairer and more democratic. 2. Grants-based systems have reasonable qualifying requirements that require far lower amounts of money to be raised than in the matching funds proposal. In both Arizona and Maine, the minimum threshold for a candidate to receive Clean Money, Clean Elections grants are low enough that candidates from major and smaller parties can meet them. In Maine, the process is simple and candidates must collect $5 qualifying contributions from voters in their district, $60 for House, $175 for Senate, and $3,200 for Governor. They must agree not to raise or spend any private money and limit spending to the amount received from the Maine Clean Elections Fund. It is even possible to make a donation to this fund easily online. In Arizona, the requirements are similar. 3, the full public financing grants in Clean Money, Clean Election system are equal and sufficient to run an effective competitive campaign. For instance, in Arizona, the disbursement and spending limits are quite competitive. For governor, $896,602 for the primary and $1.3 million for the general. For attorney general, $232,000 for the primary and $348,000 for the general. For legislature, $18,000 for the primary and $27,000 for the general. Most importantly, each state decides the level of funding for candidates that opt into the system that would be effective and competitive. Clearly, this would be higher in New York. 4, party committee contributions to candidates in a Clean Money, Clean Election systems are limited or eliminated. This limits the influence of wealthy individuals that give soft money donations to party committees and housekeeping accounts and give some candidates an unfair advantage. 5, there is ample evidence that Clean Money, Clean Election systems increase electoral competitiveness and candidate diversity. An important study in full public financing systems that looked specifically at Arizona and Maine concluded that clean elections laws boost the number of effective candidates in both open seat and races with an incumbent. The study also found the effect is pronounced in elections with an incumbent where the challenger opts into the clean election system, meaning the most difficult races saw a striking increase in competition. Conversely, matching fund systems do not show the same increase in electoral competitiveness. There is also evidence that these systems increase the diversity of candidates as well. 6, New York State has had a Clean Money, Clean Elections bill in the legislature tailored to our specific needs. Most recently, in the 2013-2014 legislative session, former Senator Avella and Assemblymember Ortiz sponsored S4501A4116. This bill contained the elements of Clean Money, Clean Election systems, including a reasonable threshold for contributions and a ban on private fundraising from those that opted in. So, for instance, State Assembly 400 contributions of $5 to $250, State Senate 1,000 contributions of $5 to $250, and Governor 20,000 contributions of $5 to $250. Grant sufficient to run a competitive campaign. For primaries, $2 per voter enrolled in the party of the candidate in the district. For general elections, State Assembly 100,000, State Senate 300,000, and Governor 7.5 million. It also provided funding to political parties that agree to opt into a Clean Money system. The Clean Money bill provided any political party that agreed not to accept contributions of over $5,000 a year from any entity with a 2-to-1 match on all contributions from registered New York voters of up to $250 per calendar year and up to a total of $2.5 million for the whole state party in any calendar year. Office holders would have been limited in their campaign fundraising and spending in non-election years, reducing pay-to-play and lobbying influence and personal misuse of funds by corrupt politicians. Office holders who participate in the Clean Money system would have been limited in their non-year campaign account fundraising expenditures by State Assembly $10,000 in both receipts and expenditures, State Senate $25,000, and Governor $100,000. 7, the Supreme Court decision in 2011's Freedom Club PAC v. Bennett did not strike down Clean Money, Clean Elections, and Arizona, Connecticut, and Maine have modified their systems to comply with the law and have the system remain competitive. SCOTUS disqualified the Fair Fight supplementary grants that could top off the basic public funding grant when a privately funded candidate's spending reached a certain threshold. Instead, Arizona, Connecticut, and Maine have modified their systems, increasing initial grants to candidates to compensate. Maine has continued to offer modified supplemental payments to legislative and gubernatorial candidates that continue to collect qualifying contributions. Not only is Clean Money, Clean Elections still viable, in Connecticut, the Democratic Governor Malloy used the Clean Money grant plus a Fair Fight additional grant to beat a well-financed, privately funded Republican in a close race in 2010. In 2014, Malloy won again with a larger single grant, participating in the Clean Money system again, as did his Republican opponent. While the Connecticut system is not without its problems, and is far less fair than Arizona or Maine's, it is but one example that shows the system remains viable. 8. Thus, the Green Party believes that a Clean Money, Clean Election system of full public campaign finance that allows for increasing competitiveness of elections, limiting the influence of private monies, and creating a more level playing field for all parties and candidates, given the evidence presented, that is a system of public campaign financing that should be enacted in New York, and not the flawed system of partial public campaign funding via matching funds. The other great reform question before this commission is the possibility of banning electoral fusion. As the only political party beside the Democratic and Republican parties to consistently and regularly run our own candidates, and the only one to have voluntarily chosen not to participate in electoral fusion and cross endorsements, the Green Party fully supports a total ban on fusion. There are 5 compelling reasons why this is so. 1. Fusion is an anti-democratic process that leads to unfair advantages for parties and candidates that engage in it. Just as the principle of one person, one vote is at the heart of representative democracy, we believe one candidate, one party should be as well. A Green candidate that appears on the ballot once will often face candidates that appear multiple times. It is not hard to understand that Fusion provides the same unfair advantage that the system of private campaign finance does. The candidates with more lines will drown out those that have one. Voters may never see the name of a candidate that appears once, and the effect of multiple ballot lines makes it so that while a Green candidate may have only one opponent, in reality their cross-endorsed opponent may appear as 2, 3, or more candidates. These appearances matter, alongside the combined vote totals Fusion provides. 2. Fusion is part of a system of patronage in New York State politics that has contributed to a culture of corruption. It is an open secret that ballot lines are often for sale to the highest bidder. This is, at heart, pay-to-play politics that makes a mockery of democratic choice of candidates by party membership. A candidate need only acquire a Wilson Pakula from party leaders, not success in a party primary facing party voters. This system is almost comically set up to be abused, especially by smaller parties with less of a membership base. It even happens between the Democrats and Republicans. It is impossible to forget the case of former Senate Majority Leader Malcolm Smith, convicted of attempting to bribe his way onto the Republican line in the 2013 New York City mayoral election. A decade ago, the Working Families Party was accused of skirting campaign finance laws to aid Democratic Party candidates, including Bill de Blasio, and had to wind down its for-profit arm, Data and Field Services. This, again, is a result of Fusion and dirty pay-to-play politics that come with it. Fusion politics in New York has an air of quid pro quo about it that will always leave a suspicion of potential favor trading. 3. The Fusion system allows for the theft of ballot lines via the process known as opportunity to ballot. OTB, the process where unendorsed candidates from one party can force a primary in another, is an epidemic in New York State. The Green Party alone faces dozens of OTB attempts on a yearly basis. Party members have been forced to seek candidates from other parties that do not support party positions on the Green Party line. In order to ensure regular theft of Green lines, the Republican and Democratic parties have re-registered their members in the Green Party to provide signatures and votes. A ban on Fusion would, for all intents and purposes, end the practice of OTB. 4. Fusion leads to candidates on party lines that do not support the political platform of that party or the party's membership, and parties that mostly campaign for candidates in the primaries of other parties. As noted, Fusion and OTB have led to absurd situations where the Democratic and Republican parties have stolen the Green line and run campaigns opposed to Green Party positions. This is not only confusing for voters, but it deprives party members of their democratic rights to be represented by candidates that adhere to their party's values. This is true across the spectrum of parties that engage in Fusion as well. It is possible to witness smaller parties that cross-endorse mostly to affect the outcome of primaries in other parties. Not only is this a disservice to their own membership that cannot vote for these candidates, it is a disservice to the voters in the parties of the candidate that was cross-endorsed. A Fusion ban would end this troublesome practice as well. 5. There is substantial evidence that Fusion voting not only does not help third parties, but that third parties do better in states without electoral fusion. The political scientist Bernard Tamas studied Fusion across a century's worth of elections at the state level and found that Fusion tends to be correlated with the decline and collapse of third parties rather than their growth. He specifically examined New York State and the Working Families Party and concluded that even while Fusion voting was increasing in use in New York State, it had declined in the rest of the nation. It is only legal in 8 states. And that third-party candidates do better in states without Fusion. He also argued that in Fusion states like New York, parties like the Greens that do not participate in Fusion are harmed by the use of Fusion by parties that do, and therefore have their growth stymied. In conclusion, Fusion is an anti-democratic practice that contributes to a culture of corruption, backroom deals, denies party members the right to a candidate that fully represents their party's values, encourages line theft, and contributes to the decline and collapse of third parties. New York should move to join the vast majority of other states and ban the practice of Fusion. Doing so would expand democracy in New York and curb the anti-democratic practices that follow from Fusion. I want to thank the Commission for allowing me to speak, and I, along with the Green Party, are available for further consultation on either of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we ask my fellow commissioners if they have any questions, just want to acknowledge, we hear you in the other room. We are doing our best to accommodate all of the individuals who are here to testify, and we will give them an opportunity to have their chance to be heard as well. So all you're doing by yelling out is disrupting those who are speaking currently. My fellow commissioners have questions?
I do have a question. Would you mind if I read you something? I'd like your feedback on this.
Sure.
Candidates and Green Party allies. The Green Party may nominate, designate, and/or authorize the candidates of other political parties or independent bodies that share Green Party principles and goals and are politically and financially independent of the big banks and corporations and their political representatives in the Democrat, Republican, and allied parties. So your rules actually allow for fusion voting.
In the rules that were adopted, that is true, but we do not do so by principle. Yes.
Why don't you amend your rules?
That is something that we are looking towards doing. But one of the reasons that we have not done that is because in 2010 there was an argument about potentially endorsing someone like Ralph Nader, who is not running on any particular line.
So you've thought about it? Because these rules were filed, these are your official rules filed in 2015. So even since 2010, you haven't amended them after you discounted
This is true,
Ms.
but I think if you'll look, we do not cross-endorse or accept fusion.
You should probably change your rules then, because it probably gives people mixed messages.
Do you have a citation, or tell us where to find this study you referred to of the Arizona and Maine clean election
Yeah,
program?
it's included in my report. Let me just see here. It should be number 11. The impact of public financing on electoral competition, footnote 11.
It's a footnote in your report. Yeah.
If you have it in front of you, can you just read the citation?
It's a web link, so.
It's a web link.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Did you submit a written copy of your testimony, or will
I
you?
did, yes.
Okay.
I just didn't catch, I didn't get your written testimony, so I didn't have a chance to review what you submitted, but can you explain how you qualify for the clean election program that you're proposing?
Sure. Pretty simply, in Arizona and Maine, candidates who want to qualify for the Clean Elections grants-based system collect $5 qualifying contributions from voters in their district. So there are different levels depending on what statewide office you're running for. $60 for the House, $175 for the Senate, and $3,200 for governor. You agree not to raise or spend any private money, limit the spending to the amount received by the Maine Clean Elections Fund. So there is a process. I linked to it online. You apply to the fund and they decide, but then you are given a grant based on what the state elections fund has set.
So how is the grant determined? It's not a matching program, so how is the grant determined?
I believe what happens is that the State Clean Elections Fund takes a look at how much the election cost in the last cycle, and they set that grant based on what they believe a competitive election would cost. So,
But every candidate that qualifies gets an equal
every
amount,
candidate that chooses to opt in does get an equal amount. Yes, that's
Regardless
the
of-
purpose of the system. Yes,
regardless of what their support is. It's not proportional to their support within the district.
What it is proportional to their support within being able to fundraise the same amount, so that in terms of the qualifying contributions. So you have to reach a certain amount of qualifying contributions within their district. It's not outside.
Yeah, can we
of
turn?
their
Microphone back on?
Is there a way to turn his mic on?
The point is that they have to raise the same amount of minimum qualifying contributions within their district to qualify for the grant. And the point is to make elections competitive regardless of whether you can raise $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 or not, and actually allow for smaller or larger party candidates to qualify.
Well,
for it.
I understand on an expenditure limit
Yeah.
side, but in terms of a matching system,
Yeah.
what you're receiving in public dollars corresponds to your ability to receive small dollar donations. So there's a relational support versus taxpayer dollars going to candidates. In your model, you seem to skew that, where as long as you meet a
It's
minimum
not my
threshold,
model.
everyone gets
it's
it.
Arizona.
Well, what
and
you're
Maine's
proposing,
in-
what you're
yeah,
proposing.
Absolutely. Well, I think the point is for clean money, clean election systems that candidates would receive the same amount because it would allow for a fair election where private monies don't have an impact, so that we can have parties like the Greens or other small parties compete, or challengers to incumbents who have very large private money donations be on a similar or close to similar playing field. I mean, that's the point. It's a different way of looking at running elections. It's not, I can raise tens of thousands of dollars from special interests, wealthy donors, and then I can outcompete or drown out people with that kind of cash. It's, I can raise this amount of support from within the district, and we can have competition based on the ideas of our campaign and not have to worry about fundraising.
You mentioned in your testimony that there was a Green Party candidate who used the the pilot campaign finance system back in 2014? Or
No,
you
that
did
was
not?
a Republican candidate.
Got it. Okay, I thought you were saying. a
Yeah,
Green
that was
Party
Bob
candidate.
Antonacci who attempted to use it for the one-year pilot program for comptroller and did not make the qualifying matching funds.
Got it. When you look at the existing proposal, if we were to reference the governor's proposal or other good government groups' proposals that, you know, would hopefully incentivize smaller party candidates to participate, what would be that threshold if we didn't go down a clean money path? Like, is there a proposal you would recommend in that regard?
I don't have an exact proposal, but you know, I would say that in terms of matching funds, if you're going to make it possible for smaller parties to compete, $650,000 for governor, 6,500 matchable contributions is very high. I mean, it might be something where we would look at lowering it to you know, somewhere around maybe $20,000, and the matchable contributions could be you know, off the top of my head, you know. I'm not sure, but you know, something lower, closer to the qualifying funds grants for Maine or Arizona. Something where a party like the Greens or other candidates that don't take or don't have access to that large money donation for statewide, state senate or state assembly can have potential buy into that fund. I think would be better. So you know, for state assembly, a $10,000 minimum seems rather high. I would bring it down closer to 1,000. I think.
That's helpful. And if you want to take more time to actually consider or flesh out a proposal, you know, as we are continuing to do our work, that would be appreciated. We'd love to
Wonderful. Thank
receive
you.
that. Further questions?
Nope.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Would like to call the next witness, Jessica Wisniewski, who I see is making her way to the front from Citizen Action.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jessica Wisniewski. I'm the co-director of Citizen Action of New York. As some of you know, Citizen Action has long been at the forefront of the movement to get big money out of politics and create and implement a strong voluntary system of public financing in New York State. Although I'm the co-director, I'm joined by grassroots activists from Binghamton, Utica, Hudson Valley, all across the state who came here, the closest hearing today, to give their own individual remarks as citizens and residents of New York. For the past 14 years, I've had, it has to be thousands of conversations, honestly. I've worked much of my career on this issue, talked to countless legislators in and out of New York, administrators, grassroots activists, and so my testimony today speaks from that experience, but also speaks to some of the concerns I heard you all bring up in the first public hearing last week. And so, of course, your task is critical. It will impact, what you do will impact innumerable racial and social justice issues for generations. That's a really big deal. And so I thank you for your service and hope that you will be laser focused on your goal of creating a robust model for the nation. I thought it would be appropriate to just give a tiny bit of, I also wanted to say, oftentimes this myth is perpetuated that people don't care about this issue. It's wonky, it's campaign finance reform, who the heck cares about that? And yes, is it a crisis issue like housing insecurity, food insecurity, problems in our education system, so many things that New Yorkers are facing on a daily basis? No, but I can tell you, you talk to anyone walking down the street about the issue of money in politics and they get it like that. Right? And you talk about the solution and they're like, that just might work. So I encourage you not to buy into this myth that the people of New York don't care about this. They care about it deeply. And to rebuild trust in government is necessary for our democracy to thrive and for the issues that are crisis issues in their daily lives to be dealt with and met appropriately by government. So a little bit of history, in case you don't know. Obviously this has been an issue for a long time. Teddy Roosevelt talked about it many years ago, the presidential public financing system in response to Watergate. It was around that time in the 70s and 80s that actually the state assembly, Dick Godfrey reminds me, wrote the first bill that New York City actually used as a model. And of course, Shelley Silver, as elections chair early in his career and then speaker, held the bill for many years and passed it in the assembly many years. In that time period, also, as Peter explained, Maine and Arizona, through citizen initiative and referendum, popped off public financing programs in different styles. New York City perfected its system, made it stronger throughout. As New York City went matching from 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 6-to-1, as did the bill in the Assembly and the matching bill in the Senate. And so the experiment of this has been happening for quite some time. And so you don't just have New York City to look to, but it is New York City that has done an excellent job in perfecting the system they have, even though, of course, everything could be improved. And of course, most recently, our new Congress in 2019 passed H.R. 1, first and foremost, with every Democratic member of Congress voting for it, that included a matching fund system that many of the experts have encouraged you to put in place, right, for the nation. So here are some recommendations based on what I heard at the last meeting and some of the things I've heard historically from particularly legislators and candidates who have the most self-interest in getting this right? Number one, public financing systems succeed when you fully commit to a robust system, not a half measure, short-term experiment or pilot, right? Like, we've been through this with the comptroller's race in 2014. We did a huge, robust campaign. The legislature balked at the end and did this pilot project. Peter talked about how it wasn't successful. You need a bigger pool. New Jersey did this years ago with just 3 districts, their experiment. There wasn't enough of a sample of how things could go. Things vary so greatly, candidate by candidate, district by district. Every race is different. You need the full sample to then know, where do we need to make improvements? Something in these systems that constantly happen, right? Even if you get it 95% there, you're still going to need to improve over time. And you need a large enough sample to do that. So I encourage you to fully implement, full Assembly, full Senate, statewide as they come, right? And not to pull something else that honestly lots of elected officials who really don't want this would do, is like start it 10 years from now, right? We can implement this within 2 full years run up, and then 2 years later for statewides. Number 2, a fair and effective public financing system will have built-in equity and equal access across the state. This is the beauty of a matching fund system. We recommend 6-to-1 if you want to enhance in-district contributions to 8-to-1 or something similar. I think that's a good idea. But it's up to the candidate and the campaign to use the system for what they need it for, right? And it's like campaign strategy doesn't go out the window. If I'm in a highly competitive race, you bet I'm gonna go for gold and get as many possible small contributions and max out on those public funds as I need to. In New York, we have high cost, when the elections are competitive, they're often very high cost. A lot of races, even with this system hopefully increasing competition, won't be as high cost, or maybe there won't be much competition, and then you use the system as needed to raise enough money to get your name out, to run a decent campaign. And so the matching fund system gives flexibility to the needs of candidates and to help balance out the needs of different kinds of districts across the state. I will say one of the things that we've heard concern around is like, one thing I wanted to mention in this section also was I heard a little bit of pushback of Professor Malbin's modeling on cost, right? I am grateful the legislature was very clear in their $100 million because other states have really struggled. If you don't know the money's coming in the budget, it's never gonna work, right? And people don't have faith in the system, so I'm glad for that. But we have seen over time as Maine, Arizona, Connecticut, other states have implemented their systems, the first time around, you maybe get 30% participation. The next time, 60. Tops out about 80%. As the culture is changing about how you operate campaigns. And some candidates are not going to use it. It's a voluntary system. We encourage participation, but especially on cost, it's not 100% of races are going to have 100% participation and totally max out, which is, I just thought, worth noting. One of the problems that we've heard that is kind of related, for years, elected officials who just clearly don't want this system because they don't want competition, is nuisance candidates. People will abuse the system. People will just run for office so they can get those public funds and pocket them and get their name out. I don't know. There's probably lots of people in here who have run for office before, and it is no easy task, right? This is a huge service, a whole lot of work, and the opposite is actually true. We have the most ridiculously uncompetitive elections in New York State. So often voters get one choice, who their representative will be in Albany. And so there's a sweet spot, and that sweet spot, of course, is using the qualifying contributions, right? So you've really got to look to get that right. Because you don't, there could be a nuisance candidate, someone who is trying to game it. Let's make sure that the qualifiers are high enough that you have to be a legitimate candidate with true community support and get those small donations to get in. But don't make it so hard that it's impossible for a grassroots candidate to succeed. And so there is a sweet spot there. Professor Malvin has done a bunch of numbers on it, but I encourage you to think critically about that. Number 3, regional differentiation, I think is a really terrible idea. At the hearing last week, there was some, I heard some chatter about this. I strongly push back. First and foremost, New York City is a super clear example of some of the highest wealth districts and some of the lowest wealth districts in the country. And there's 70% participation, right? We see the small donations coming from in the district and outside of the district. Again, that kind of flexibility in the system with half the qualifiers, some coming within the district, others coming from outside is okay. That kind of flexibility in the system is the problem that you're trying to solve with the different regional differentiation. The other part of this is it buys into the myth that somehow downstate elections cost more than upstate elections. Well, anybody who was a part of Darrell Albertine's race in the North Country or Rochester races Rochester races for state Senate, a dozen marginal assembly seats are dependent on tons of funding from the Democratic Party to keep their seats. It might have high rent in New York City and you're putting gasoline in your car to drive around upstate New York. It's a wash. And again, the flexibility in a matching fund system meets those needs without you having to deal with it, right? It's that flexibility. So I would push back against that concept of somehow Long Island and upstate and New York City are different. The system's built-in flexibility.
Is there no difference in the media markets and the cost to run an election?
People in New York City don't buy ads. Because they're extraordinarily expensive. Right. They do different methods.
But if you're in, say, Long Island, and you are using more expensive media markets than you are maybe in the southern tier or northern New York, you see no differential there?
I'm sure there's a differential in media markets, yes, if you want to use that tactic in your campaign. Based on what I have seen over the past decade, I'm sure you see the same thing, especially in specials, but in competitive races, regardless of what region they're in, they cost somewhere between $600,000 and $1 million, right? And that has been true on Long Island. It's been true in upstate.
My fear is this: when you're using a public financing system and you have a competitive race, you're limiting now or restricting the ability to raise money through the party or through the candidate. You're essentially empowering the Independent Expenditure Committee. And that's the balance that I'm concerned with in terms of what the expenses are in different areas of the state. So that's a concern we were trying to address, or I was raising in New York City in the last year.
I would say a few things. Number one, my 5th point on here is there should be no spending limit, of course, right? Once you max out, if you're in a highly competitive race, once you max out on the public funds, you hit the public funding cap, you can still under the contribution limit, which I hope you all will lower, both in and out of the system, still raise and spend money as you need to, right? And I don't think it invites IEs. I think independent expenditures have been around and will continue to be around, regardless of whether or not you're using a public financing system. The two don't relate because there's no spending cap in a public financing system.
Just to follow up on that, that's the other balance that I struggle with is if there is no expenditure limit, raising limit for a candidate, it does allow you to be more competitive, say, against an independent expenditure committee. However, now it seems like you're just subsidizing and creating a baseline funding through taxpayer dollars, of which now, in that competitive district, the candidate is equally dependent upon the money coming in beyond what they're able to raise through a matching program. So I see it causing problems on both sides of it.
So first, you need to lower the limit substantially, both in and outside the system, in order to incentivize being in the system, of course, but also because you don't want the influence of very large contributions. Lower the contribution limit. Number two, look, not every race is going to be super competitive. A vast majority, what we've seen in places like Connecticut is both candidates get in the public financing system. They both raise money. They don't go that much further than the public funding cap, and they compete on a pretty equal playing field due to the public financing system. And the more you give access to candidates to scoop up those small donations and be dependent on those small donations, and that there's enough to be competitive, you're doing great, right? There is no perfect system unless we could mandate all public financing with a cap, and this is it. Buckley v. Vallejo said clearly we couldn't do that, and so you have to construct a system that is flexible and works as best as possible.
My concern, I'd like you to see if you have thoughts on it, is not so much the regional disparities in the cost of an election. It is the difficulty, I think, that some lower economic districts, poorer districts, if you will, are going to have meeting a threshold and also getting the numbers matchable. So my thought is, I'd like your opinion on it, is this. I think you have to find, let's use an assembly race as an example. You have to find a threshold that is not too easy for some districts and not too hard for other districts, which is difficult. So I was interested in your view, and it seemed that you're opposed to it, of some differential based upon what I refer to as the average median income model. You know, no matter where you are, you could be upstate, you could be downstate, doesn't make a difference. It's just, you know, some modification of both the threshold that you need to achieve, and also even, I would say, the match. You know, multiplying the match in that way. Because from in-district, multiplying the match from in-district folks.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would really study how the participation rates have gone in New York City from the maps I've seen and the data I've seen, and honestly, based on maybe because I was originally a grassroots canvasser, knocking on doors, asking for funding for an organization in all kinds of economic neighborhoods, right? Because my own organization has many low-income people who happily give their $20 annual membership. I think we need to be careful to not say that low-income communities or economically disadvantaged communities somehow are going to participate less in their democracy, because their $10 turning into $70 is meaningful to them, and it's a meaningful way. So it's just a little pushback, slippery slope.
I don't mean to suggest that, and I don't. That's not what I'm trying to get across. What I'm saying is this: for in-district money, I think that you're going to have a better chance in my neighborhood in Nassau County getting people giving $250 then you're going to have a chance in some other communities getting $20. And so that the match, what I'm looking at is the possibility of developing a system where if you're at or above the state average median income, it is a 6-to-1 match, which is what everybody's been calling for. But below that, I'm comfortable with going with a 8, 10, 12, even 12 to 1 match for lower income folks. And why can't? Because they don't have it's not that they don't want to participate, but they can't compete in participation with somebody who's got a lot more money.
I wouldn't be opposed to that. It would be really important to be careful how to do it, right? Okay. And it would be important to test it and see how it. I need to put some thought into it. Let me put some thought into it and get back to you. Okay. I think we're lucky to have it would also, the administration of it, you'd have to be very careful of. My next point was actually about administrative agencies. And so let's make sure it can be administered without a nightmare, so people's matches are actually getting matched what they're supposed to and candidates know what they're doing. It's gonna have to be pretty sophisticated if we do it that way. But yeah, let me put thought into it. It's not a bad idea.
Since you're going to consider his question, can you also consider if you're going to do your original thought, which is one across all board for all districts, can you put in what will you actually propose? And then if you're gonna do different, depending on the district, also put in what will you propose?
Sure. I mean,
Take both into consideration and then put in one individual proposal for each.
sure. Yeah, I can do that. I mean, we have been supportive of a 6-to-1 match. I think an 8-to-1 or even 10-to-1, like New York City is now doing and considered. Maybe the in-district versus out-of-district match is a possibility there. Again, it does speak to making sure the administrative agency is really prepared to handle that. And so let's make sure we have an independent agency that is fully staffed, has a serious budget to deal with all of this. One of the things I have heard a ton from sitting legislators, from some folks with experience in New York City, is we have to be incredibly careful to create a culture in the administrative agency that is not this got you culture, right? Where candidates who didn't cross their T or dot their I or got something in late feel shamed, right? That we want to craft an agency that has a culture of real candidate services. That's based on countless conversations with lawmakers and candidates that I've had in the New York State Legislature. I have very little time left, and I just want to get out my last point, which of course is about fusion voting. For 14 years that I've worked in New York on this, not once in 14 years has any lawmaker, voter, organization, or group that I have spoken to about public financing of elections ever asked me or related it in any way to fusion voting. Of course, New York City and Connecticut now have a long experience of both systems being together and working quite well. And of course, obviously we're talking about this because just in the last 3 months it's come up. But I encourage, of course, like any campaign finance, voting, or election laws, there are things that we need to fix about New York State's fusion voting system, right? But that should be left to the legislature, just like other laws. Your duty is to craft and implement a public campaign financing system. And so we should stop OTVs. We should do fusion fixes, right? But I don't think that is what this body needs to focus on. The task ahead with public financing is critical and heavy. And I encourage you to really focus on that and not take the bait of what many people on the outside see as party politics and retribution, if you will. I fear for all of you that in the 11th hour you'll get the call from the people who appointed you to say, we figured it out. Here's what's going to happen, right? Here's what we need you to do. I implore you to use your knowledge that you bring to this and the knowledge you hear to do what is best for the people of New York. Thank you.
Can we turn her mic back on? I think we have some questions from commissioners. Yeah,
Yeah.
you could turn her mic back on. Thank you.
I just have a couple questions for you. You indicated that you thought anything that having to do with fusion voting should be done by the legislature. Do you agree that a public financing program should have been done by the legislature as well?
Oh, I think yes, for years we've been pushing them. They should have done it years ago. They should have done it on April 1st in the budget. They didn't. They chose for you to design it and implement it. So now I'm good. Like, I believe in you all, and you're incredibly thoughtful about it. So I'm excited to see what you come up with. I mean, by the way, it's done, right?
Wait,
we've been working on this for 20 years.
May I just interrupt? You believe in us all, but you think we're all going to get that call and do
Oh,
what
absolutely.
Then you don't really believe in us.
No, I'm just imploring you to push back against the call.
Oh, against the machine.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, like, be an independent group that solidifies, and if you get the call, don't listen. And I trust that you won't.
I have a
Sure. And I have one other question that, I agree with. I appreciate all your points and the time and effort you put into it. But I did take great issue with one of your comments, that elected officials don't want this system because they don't want competition. Couldn't it be they don't want to spend $100 million a year on welfare for campaigns, and that they'd rather spend it on prison reentry programs or opioid abuse or fixing the roads or...
So I apologize for my generalization.
Right.
There are many elected officials who actually very much support this system because they know that we will never truly prioritize the needs of New Yorkers as long as in buildings like this all across this city, every year, the fundraisers come in and the lobbyists put checks in their hands. They don't want that system anymore. They'd rather this one because they know it will allow the prioritization of those issues.
What do you think the average person on the street, not this group, not the groups at our hearings, but what do you think? I think the polling is, 29% in favor of public financing of campaigns?
I will get you polling that shows upwards of 75% in support of public financing from here in New York, new national polling. People overwhelmingly believe in democracy and in the investment of democracy.
I'd like to see the crosstabs on that
Sure,
poll.
of course,
actually.
I will give it to you with crosstabs.
That would be good. And one other question, just back to the same thing. I mean, it was really, I know you've apologized, but it was offensive to think that people that say that public money shouldn't fund political campaigns because they think it's a better use of money to help pre-K,
When you
prison reentry programs. Look at the opioid epidemic. Just for people, I was sitting on the train, and a woman was sitting there next to me that works for the Department of Health, and her charge is opioid overdose. She has to lay off 2 people because she didn't get a grant, and I'm going to spend $100 million a year on
Well,
subsidizing political campaigns?
Think about this. Maybe if we had elected officials only beholden to the donors, or the small donors in their district, we would actually be able to tax Wall Street and the real estate interests and the super rich and fully fund all the things New Yorkers need. But instead, Wall Street and real estate and the lobbyists are lining the pockets of far too many elected officials in this state. And we need a system to rebalance that. And there are some elected officials who told me to their face, why on earth would I dig my own grave with this issue? And there are some elected officials who are like, my God, let's fight for this, because I want to be free of this culture of having to put my hand out and dial for dollars. And so they couldn't decide down there at the Capitol because those are the two extremes. And so now it's up to you.
Well, I actually think there was an ideological debate in one of the conferences about the money being better spent somewhere else.
There are many Republican legislators in particular.
And I'm
who
not just talking, we don't
believe
control
that.
the conferences. I'm talking about
I
the
would
majorities that didn't
I would
do it in the
implore them
legislature.
in one of the richest states in America to take a good look at the tax rolls and see the $9 billion we're spending in economic subsidies, many of which have been part of the corruption scandals that you all, I'm sure, will hear about, right? Where big corporations are getting handouts left and right in this state, and they're padding the pockets of elected officials and lobbyists. So there's a correlation. People get it. This is not rocket science. This is common sense stuff. And there's a real solution on the table. Is it perfect? No. Will it go a heck of a long way? Yes.
Just one more question, and there's no need to go off on rich people or corporations or anything. It's just a simple question. Do you think people would be offended if they knew that a portion of their money was going to support someone that they completely and ideologically disagree with?
In the same way I do about the war machine or subsidies
No.
to the real estate market.
No,
of course. But we live in a democracy. We live in a democracy. I pay the check of my elected official even though I disagree with them. I give them money to stay in a nice hotel overnight here in Albany so they can do the business of the people in that building. Do I agree with them? I don't. Some I do, some I don't. This is a democracy. This is our society. Our government is for the purpose of reflecting and representing all people. And so, yes, this is an investment in our democracy, and I think people absolutely, nearly everyone in this room and many more, support it.
Like I said, I'm not speaking to this audience necessarily, more the general
I'll
population
get you the
of the
polling,
state.
for sure.
I think there were other questions just before you step away.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment in response to your statement about the call, and I want to make it clear for the record that the majority leader of the state senate that appointed me has made no effort to influence what my views are on fusion voting or anything else, and I don't expect she will. So that I want to
Great.
make that clear.
You know, I will say that there are really, there's Senate Assembly staff, I mean, Kathleen O'Keefe, Chris Higgins, folks, and I'm sorry, Mylan isn't here, but glad she's a part of this. People who have worked on this for decades. They're experts in drafting this legislation. They all have side-by-side charts. of the Speaker Hasty's last bill, the governor's bill, Andrea Stewart Cousins' bill, the Brennan Center's bill. It's all the knowledge is there. They came very close on April 1st to do this with a lot of insight and input from experts. So I encourage you to dig up those documents and use them as resources.
And I did have a question that goes to that issue. So you raised these other bills, and you raised the issue, you raised the Brennan Center's proposed bills. To me, the setting of contribution limits for participants and non-participants is really key. That balance has to be
Yes.
really the right balance. Do you have a recommendation as to what that spread should be, or which of the proposals, either the bills or the Brennan Center or anybody
Yeah.
else's views, we should adopt?
I mean, if it was up to me, I'd go crazy and lower them dramatically altogether, and they'd be the same in and out, right? Over the years, because we have done this in the realm of politics, that has not been feasible, right, to square them up entirely. And so, I'd have to look at the proposals to give a solid recommendation. I mean, even as low as members of Congress get seem pretty reasonable to me. But I'm sure my friends in the State Assembly and Senate would be really nervous about bringing them down so dramatically. I think you're right that it's about bringing them down together in order to incentivize the system is the most important way to look at the policy. But I can get back to you on specifics.
And okay,
I'm
just
so
one
sorry.
second, I have one more question. Do you think we should give serious consideration to a clean money approach like advocated by the Green Party?
Oh man, Peter Lavigne, after my own heart. I mean, for years I pushed early in my career for a clean money, clean election system when Maine and Arizona did it. It became clear for two reasons that was a challenge for New York. Number one, the cost of elections was already very high, right? And so the idea of giving, to your point on funding, the matching fund system, because it varies in usage based on need, will keep costs relatively steady. A clean money, clean election system, if you give a grant, you better give a heck of a grant across the board, because if you can't get more than that grant and you're in a highly competitive race, it's going to leave you high and dry as a participant. So there's that, and we do have this 30 years of culture and experience and understanding and knowledge of the New York City matching fund system that has worked quite successfului. In my time, as I've pushed the legislature to take this on, a lot of those folks are from New York City, know that system, and so that's gotten ingrained in kind of their thinking and their culture. So making that dramatic of a shift hasn't been an option for advocates before. And to be honest, New York City system and other matching fund systems work very well, and I think meet the needs that I described before around flexibility in the system that even now a clean money, clean election system can't offer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to add that once you submit your recommendations or proposals to all the commissioners, including myself, can you also cite to your sources?
Of course.
And so we can go over them as well?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, go ahead, David.
I just have just one quick question. You had said, you pointed to the $100 million as being useful in ensuring that we're able to move forward with something that works, the need for a robust system to increase the likelihood of success, but also the importance of an independent administrator with a robust budget. I think our interpretation has been that the administrative budget is coming out of the $100 million.
I agree, yes.
So I'm curious, do you think it's more important to have a robust public matching system, or to divert some of those dollars, take them away from candidates, and give it to the independent administrator, rather than having them absorbed into an existing agency?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of like looking into crosstabs, look, I would implore you. We've worked with Professor Malbin's numbers from the Campaign Finance Institute for years, and the depth of his methodology and numbers that he has pulled from actual experience in elections, and then based on usage in other states, is really critical to dig deep on to understand that it's a really good. You won't meet that $100,000 mark. I think you can fully fund an agency and on an annual basis meet the needs over time, right? It's per year you're funding, but it's only every other year that you're in the election cycle. I think we will be just fine with less than 100 million annually to fund the system for both administrative agency and the matching funds.
You anticipated, though, that if we get it right, you'll likely see 80-90% buy-in from candidates. 217 offices at that level where, the current numbers that are being thrown around, does that math really work out?
Not everyone will max out on their public funding cap.
Right.
It's just, that's been I implore you to look back. I don't have it in all of Professor Malbin's numbers in front of me, but this is what he did 4 years ago in 2014, 2015. He's got the numbers from back then that looked back to election cycles. He redid those numbers that looked back at the facts of the 2 election cycles before. The increased small donations, even an increase in small donations, not everybody's going to hit the cap. Not every race is going to be 100% usage of the system, right? I think, to your point, some people may fundamentally not even believe in it and not use the system. I hope Republicans use this. I admire Senator John McCain for his years of support of Arizona's public financing system, so I hope Republicans will use it, but in New York they might not since they've been so opposed. So there you go. That's going to cut costs down right away. So I think look at the modeling that Professor Malbin did, to really look at the details of that.
I just want to address the modeling. Again, I believe we can figure it out, and I believe we can afford it within the cap. So
Thank you, Jay.
I start with that. But I will tell you this. The modeling troubles me, and we have to figure out, and I'd like to work on that with the commission. Here's what I see. I'm just giving experience from Suffolk and Nassau and Suffolk counties, what I see. A lot of times we don't have competitive races because we just don't have the money. If we had a matching fund system, we would have the money.
You would have increased,
And
yes.
that's the goal, by the way, of the system, is to get these more competitive. So what I'm just saying is we have to be cautious on the modeling, because once you do have a matching fund system, and by the way, it's the same upstate as I hear and speak to folks from upstate who tell me that we just don't have the money, so it's not competitive in some of these assembly seats in particular.
Absolutely.
So I just think we have to be careful on the modeling to build in a prediction that when there is matching funds, you're going to find more candidates being able to compete, and thus more money being raised in those districts.
I think because he has the numbers all laid out based on the facts of the past election cycles, throwing in different usage rates would be easily to model out for you, and the Campaign Finance Institute has always been willing to do that for us.
The Brennan Center did that in their briefing book as well.
Yeah.
If I may ask a question just specifically on the administrative agency that you would recommend be responsible for this important charge. You said, if there's regional differentiation or differentiation within districts for matching and outside the district matching at a different level, it's important to have strong administration there. Who do you recommend? Is it the Board of Elections? Is it some new agency? Like what specifically would Citizen Action recommend in this regard?
I think a new agency, separate and apart, who's solely focused on making this work. I don't think the Board of Elections is probably the best choice, and it's certainly its current 2-party, 4-person, right? You need a kind of 5th or 7-member board.
They changed that format, right? 5 years ago. So there is a 5th vote.
Okay, my apologies. The Board of Elections has not been known in New York State to be the most up to date and speed in implementation of things. I think they have a big job on their hands.
Can you give us an example of that?
Not with the little time I have left. It's a separate.
No, I'm a
separate and
commissioner.
apart
I'll give you
issue.
plenty of time. Go ahead and tell me what we aren't up to speed on.
So, I think there should be a separate agency, campaign finance board of some kind.
And how would it be appointed? Independently, like we are, getting the call?
I'll admit, I am not an expert in putting together independent coalitions. There are many in New York State and across the country who are. I think Blair Horner is here, and he might have an answer to that question if he testifies today. Has looked into this extensively, and I have not. So, but I do think it should be an independent agency whose sole focus is to do campaign finance reform in New York, to give that gravity of the making sure the system works. And not have to do
versus
with
getting
everything
on the
else.
ballot.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no gravity in what we do, right?
Any further questions?
I just want to follow up in terms of that independent agency, and how would people for that board, how would you recommend that they be selected?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have some ideas, but rather think about it. And also, like I said, there are
I know you're
people
going
like
to do
Blair,
some
Susan.
follow-up. If
Yeah.
you could include, even your suggestions, that would be helpful.
Sure.
I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
I mean, creating a pool of candidates to be selected by a body. I believe in representative democracy, so I don't think it's a bad thing that majority leaders and minority leaders choose people. But I think there's a way of creating, like you, a pool of experts in the field, and to be selected together. It would be important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Sorry.
I was, well,
Yeah,
one, I was
Commissioner
just going to point out, 7 of us are appointed by one party. So when you're using this as an example of independence, it's a little different when you're talking about controlling the electoral process. And that's part of the concern with the new agency and whether or not we have the bandwidth and the time to come up with something that ensures that our democracy isn't undermined through our failure to create some culture that we're relying on within this new agency. That's, to me, that's a heavy lift, and it's very concerning. And we have a couple of months to do that.
Like I
So
said,
I don't even, I'm just making the comment on
Yeah,
that. So,
there's tons of examples, and look at what
Us?
has the governor suggested, what has the Brennan Center suggested, what do other good government experts who have studied this specifically recommend. They've been thinking about it a very long time, and I'm sure they have very good suggestions.
I'm not, I raised this question in the last hearing, and I'm not in any way picking on unions. I just look at where the money sources are in our current setup, and I'm not hearing a lot of conversation. I hear about the corporate, I hear about LLC even. What's your position on how we treat unions in this makeup?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is that unions can't just reform themselves again and again and again and again to skirt campaign finance laws in a way that LLCs, for example, can,
They
right?
changed that rule.
Yeah, but
too.
I'm saying currently,
Yes, they do.
with a public matching fund system, how do we treat union contributions?
I think you would. I'd have to look back at what we recommend.
Nobody thinks about
I
unions.
fundamentally, of course, know that unions are organizations representative rank and file working people across the state. So I think they're quite different than corporations. But
So
I would have to look
you don't
back
think
in
there
our-
are special interests?
Yeah.
Quiet,
No,
please, in the other
I
room,
don't.
sorry.
I think they represent working people of New York State, and I don't think the working people of New York State are a special interest.
Okay.
I'm good. I'm going to go because there's so many wonderful people
Thank
who've
you.
traveled so far to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, we're going to get the election. So we have Albany Common Council from the 11th Ward, Alfredo Ballerin. Did I miss? Thank you so much. We have Plattsburgh Town Council member Tom Wood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How does this work? You tell me when it starts or something?
Is it
There's a clock
ready?
right there.
Yep,
You got one there.
Okay.
3 minutes,
Very
thank
good.
you, sir.
Commissioners, I want to thank you for the chance to speak to the important work that you have to do. My name is Tom Wood. I'm from the town of Plattsburgh in Clinton County. I strongly support.
Can you speak into the microphone, sir? We can't
I
hear you.
strongly support a public financing system which includes at least a 6-to-1 match. I would recommend more, especially in my particular area where there are very few wealthy people. The small donations should be from inside the district, not outside the district. I think that the contribution levels of $69,700 for statewide office and $19,300 for state senate and $19,300 for assembly are far too high. Any medium or low-income household could not possibly afford to give these amounts, leaving only the wealthiest to contribute and to thereby influence legislators. Limits should be set at no more than the federal level of $5,600 per election cycle. Money for candidates should not come from outside New York. An independent enforcement unit should be set up and be given the power to make sure donors adhere to the new rules. I'm an elected town council person, having served 15 and a half years. I've been Democratic chair for my town. I've served as a state committee person for the New York State Democratic Party. I re-registered with the Working Families Party since my philosophy on public policy most resembled theirs. I am now a state committee person for the WFP. I ran for office in 1991 and 2001 as a registered Democrat and lost both elections. In 2003, I sought and received the WFP cross endorsement and won by 30 votes, with a winning margin coming from the votes on the WFP line. When later I ran as a registrant of the WFP with the cross endorsement of the Democratic Party, I won again. I and the people who were elected to after me would not be in office if we did not have cross endorsement. Please do not change the New York State fusion system. The WFP in the North Country endorsed entirely our board. They felt that they were very representative and that they cared about the interest of the people. It consisted of 2 Democrats, 1 Independent Party member, 1 Republican, and myself, a WFP member. Many people in the North Country will not vote for a candidate on a major party line, but will vote for that person on a minor party line, and many do not register in a major party because they do not like the programs and actions of either. The ability to vote for a person on a third party line without wasting their vote encourages participation in our democracy. As you know, the percentage of persons voting in our elections is the lowest almost in the world. We need to do more to strengthen our democracy. The commission you serve on was formed in response to citizens who were upset with the big money dominance in New York State politics. There was no outcry for fusion to change fusion voting. Please set aside this and concentrate on the public financing system, which will lead the nation in becoming a more democratic, inclusive for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Joan Mandel.
Good morning. I'm Joan Mandel, professor of sociology at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. I'm the executive director of the Democracy Matters Institute. Democracy Matters for 2 decades has worked with hundreds of chapters of college and high school students across New York and elsewhere. Democracy Matters students, some of whom will be testifying during your hearings, organize other students and community members to get big money out of politics with public financing and to get people back in. That said, I'm here today as someone who personally believes that public financing of election campaigns is the single most important reform that can effectively counter the apathy and political cynicism that we see in so many New Yorkers, both young and old. My teaching and research has centered on questions of how democracies work and how democracies fail. The widespread belief that our elections are like auctions, that politicians are bought and sold by big donors, and that ordinary New Yorkers have no voice because of the power of political money are enormous warning signs that our democracy right here in New York State is failing. Volunteer public campaign financing is both constitutional and successful in deepening democracy and has been doing so for decades in states like Connecticut, in cities like Seattle, Denver, and of course New York, as well as in counties like Montgomery and Prince George's County in Maryland. I know that every one of you wants to do the right thing. I hope you understand that the right thing to do is to give every qualified New Yorker, regardless of their economic status, the opportunity to run for office, to give every New Yorker more choice of candidates, to give every New Yorker the confidence that their representatives work for them and not for big donors, and to make New York a beacon of hope and democracy in these difficult times. Please don't let New Yorkers, and especially our young people, down. Create the strong voluntary public financing campaign system that is your mandate. And I would add that that includes not changing fusion voting. Your time is short, and it's very important that we get the public financing system that we all deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. William Ritchie? Is there a William Ritchie in the room? Oh, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Bill Ritchie. Anita Thayer is conducting legal business in Syracuse today and has asked me to read her statement. My name is Anita Thayer. I am a WFP registrant, a leader of the Capital District Working Families Party, a co-chair of the New York State Working Families Party, and a plaintiff in the lawsuit Hurley versus the Commission, etc., challenging the right of this body to constitutionally ban fusion voting in New York State. I think it would be helpful for the members of the Commission to understand how the WFP operates on the ground across the state. Although it was our support for the IDC challengers and the Governor's primary opponent that got the headlines, there is much more to fusion voting than this. Let us take a look at a typical local year in New York State. These are the odd-numbered years when most local elections take place. In January 2019, the state WFP posted their candidate questionnaire online. This multi-page document must be completed by any candidate that wants to run on the WFP line. It is overwhelmingly Democratic candidates who apply to run on this line. The questionnaire has two functions: educating candidates about our values and positions, and asking candidates if they will advocate for specific policy reforms. Approximately 130 local candidates from across the Capital District completed the questionnaire in 2019. Across the state, over 1,000 local candidates applied for our line in every local year. Each candidate who completes the questionnaire is contacted and scheduled for an in-person interview by a panel of working family members. All chapter recommendations are forwarded to our state officers, who make the final decision under our party's rules as to whether or not the non-WFP candidates will be cross-endorsed and able to run on our ballot line. We then work with the endorsed candidates to circulate petitions in the same manner as any other political party. Winning the support of the Working Families Party is an integral part of the campaign strategy for most Democratic candidates in local elections. The WFP endorsement is not only a ballot line, but a stamp of integrity that is valued by voters. It is also helpful for their success, indeed, every year that there are a handful of candidates who receive votes in the WFP line that represent their margin of victory. Clearly, grassroots, local Democratic candidates see the value of being cross-endorsed by the WFP and would not look forward to seeing the WFP forced to run candidates against them on the WFP line only. How does the WFP losing the right to cross-endorse help build a stronger, bluer, progressive majority across New York State? The job of the Commission is to promote democracy and participation, and not to look for a clever option to take away a constitutional right of political expression.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We have New York State Assembly Member Christopher, is it Tague? Sorry, did I mispronounce your name, sir? Okay.
Well, good morning. First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming here today and listening to everybody's concern. This is Democracy in Action, and although not all of us are going to agree on what is said, the fact that we can respect each other and that we live in a country where we can have our own opinions and ideas, I think today's a win-win for democracy and for New York. So thank you very much. I want to thank you folks for your dedication, your time, and service to the state of New York on this very important issue. I'm Assemblyman Chris Tague, and I represent the 102nd Assembly District. I come before you today to stand up for something that I find totally central to our democracy, and that's integrity. We're talking about the possibility of public financing of political campaigns. Here in one of the most taxed states in the country, now there's talk of taking even more money from struggling families, only this time you're going to be spending it on robocalls, political mail, negative television ads, political gamesmanship, relentless radio ads, invasive text messages, and the oppressive presence of social media ads. I don't know about you folks, but where I come from, that just sounds wrong. You can't expect a struggling single mother a hardworking middle-class family, or a college student burdened with debt to ante up money for a politician that they might not even agree with or even support. Our democracy is founded on several key principles, and integrity is one of the bedrocks. If we can't support and believe it's the candidates we want, then I think we're going down a very slippery slope. You're going to let the government decide who gets public campaign financing, who gets support to run the campaigns and buy airtime and mail the swing votes? That doesn't sound like a wellspring of corruption to me. I don't know what does. Because it certainly looks like that to me. I urge all of you to thoughtfully consider your positions on this issue. We can't open the door to this here. I think it's much too dangerous. We can't afford it. It goes against what it means to be an American voter. Too many of our forefathers bled and died for our freedom. For us to open this door to tyranny, it doesn't make any sense. In all honesty, I can't look in the eyes or the face of my constituents that I represent and keep a straight face about taxpayer-funded campaigns. The idea alone is just laughable and absurd. Thank you for your time, and God bless you when you make your decision on this very, very tough issue, and God bless all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Chad Raddock.
Good afternoon. My name is Chad Raddock. I represent the Local Progress Network of local progressive elected officials across the state.
Can you speak into the microphone, please,
Sure,
sir?
I'm sorry. Is this better?
Yeah, you can raise it up a little bit.
Leaning. So we have about 200 members across the state, and yesterday we sent to you via your email accounts a letter, and I'm just going to read the letter into the record. Dear Governor Cuomo, Majority Leader Stuart Cousins, Speaker Hasty, members of the Public Financing of Elections Commission. We, the undersigned and local officials and candidates running for local office from across New York State, write to express our support for the strongest possible small donor matching system for the state-level election campaigns. Many of the issues we face as local elected officials are impacted by the choices made in Albany. In order to have a government that responds first to the needs of our communities, we should have elections that value the voices of community members over large donors. Many elected officials are not influenced by money, but it is also true that many lobbyists wouldn't likely continue to give money if it didn't influence legislative outcomes. A process that would enable candidates to run viable campaigns on small donations instead of candidates having to rely on funding from Albany lobbyists would be good for all of our localities. We are local elected officials and candidates running to serve our community. As such, we care deeply about the state budget, as we often have to face the consequences when there are budget shortfalls. We're confident that this program, which comes with a relatively tiny annual cost, under $3 per person, is easily a money saver. It would pay for itself and then some. The less influenced, deep-pocketed special interests have, the less wasteful and expensive donor-inspired policies, government contracts, and unjustified tax breaks we're like to see. We agree with those calling for Public Financing of Elections Commission's final recommendations to include the following: a 6-to-1 match on small donations, lower limits, an independent candidate services and oversight unit, coverage of district attorney races, and a program available for primary and general elections. We also urge the legislature to be ready in December to pass fair elections legislation should the commission need any amending or any reason. Thank you for your attention. We appreciate it. And I just wanted to say also that as a recent transfer to New York from Massachusetts, when I left Massachusetts, their campaign finance that you could give as an individual was $500 per person to a candidate, period. Now that I've been gone for 10 years, it's up to $1,000. So just consider that.
Can I just ask you one question? I really don't know the answer.
Can we make sure his mic's still on? Thanks.
You indicated that it was $3 per person, and I really don't know the answer to this question. Is that $3 per New York resident?
Yes, per New Yorker.
Do you know what it would be per enrolled voter?
I do not, but I could probably figure out the math, but I just have to.
Okay, I was just curious because I don't know the answer to that. I meant to ask it last week and I just forgot. Thank you.
We'll send you an email.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maria Alfonso?
Would you give this to her? Yeah. There's another elected official here. I don't know.
Hey, good afternoon. First, I want to thank the commission for taking on this task. It's obviously a very hard one, and really, really looking forward to your continued input and what it is you come up with. Many years ago, actually when my hair was still black and I didn't need bifocals, I ran for office in Newark, New Jersey for a local office. We had some house parties. I think we had one formal event with invitations, and I spent a lot of time out in the streets talking to constituents, getting the votes and all that. And it allowed me to become the first Latina to be voted in Newark, and actually one of the first in the state. Yay me. But if I were to try to do that now, so much of my time would have to be spent dialing for dollars, as we've already stated, trying to fundraise to mount a campaign that would be like maybe 10 or 20 times more expensive than what I had to do many years ago. So I think it's really, really incumbent that we look critically at our campaign finance laws here, that we give a complete reform to them. People have already mentioned the 6-to-1 match, an independent unit to really look and make sure it gets implemented, lower contribution limits. I think all of those are really, really necessary. So a person like me, 40-something years ago, now would be able to actually run and be able to represent her constituents and devote the kind of time that is needed to be able to govern. I am the statewide president of the Citizen Action of New York, and our position on that has been very clear. But on a personal level, I really think it's important that we look to diversify who can run for elections, who can actually occupy those seats of power, so that everybody does get a chance to be adequately represented and be able to get a voice heard, and that we don't shut out anybody in this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Connecticut State Senator Matthew Lesser.
Thank you, and good morning. I think it's still good morning.
Barely
good morning. Ms. Gadachu and members of the commission, it's an honor to be here. I'm State Senator Matt Lesser, traveled from Connecticut, actually, to be here today, and I want to just, congratulate you for looking at this important issue. I think it's very important what New York is looking to do, and I would like to I'd be happy to answer questions about Connecticut's experience, but also lend my voice in support. So again, my name is Matt Lesser. I've served in the state Senate. I represent the 9th District. It is a suburban and small city district that includes essentially all of the southern suburbs of Hartford. Prior to being elected to the state Senate, I served for 10 years in the Connecticut State House of Representatives. The reason I'm here is straightforward. Connecticut, of course, is not too far away, but also there are only a few states that have public financing of elections for state legislative and constitutional offices, and there are also only a few states that permit fusion voting. There's only one state that has both public financing and fusion voting, and that's Connecticut. So when I was asked to testify as to the interaction between public financing and fusion, I was very happy to make the short drive up to this capital city. Let me start with as plain and clear a statement as I can. There is no relationship between public financing and fusion. In Connecticut, like New York, we had fusion first. Public financing, which was implemented starting with my first election in 2008, has had no impact on the Fusion system, and Fusion has had no impact on public financing. It seems to me that you're in a similar position in New York. Fusion is of long standing in the Empire State, and public financing is about to be enacted. You can do so confident that your state will not crumble if it has both. And here's why. In all public financing systems, I think with the exception of Oregon, funds go directly to the candidates who qualify. The money does not go to any particular political party that made the nomination. Whether a candidate is running on 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, they receive the same amount of money. You do not get more money for running on more than 1 line in Connecticut, and I assume that would be the case in a system that you were to enact. And I think that's how it works currently in New York City. I've been told that there was a concern raised in a prior hearing that Fusion drives up the cost of a public financing system, especially in the suburbs of Long Island. Now, the suburbs of Hartford are not the suburbs of Long Island, and I don't profess to be an expert on Long Island. But I can say that I can assume that there are probably some similarities. I can tell you that the Fusion system in the Connecticut suburbs has not raised the cost of the program. On the contrary, it keeps the costs down, as there are fewer candidates on the ballot and fewer in the public financing program when minor parties fuse with the major parties.
Excuse me, can we keep
Yes,
his mic
you can
on,
definitely
please?
keep his mic on, please. Thank you.
Finish. Please
Okay,
continue.
thank you. Yeah, and I'm very close. There is one major impact of public financing of elections that I do want to mention in closing, and that it has fundamentally changed the way that we as legislators do our jobs. We spend much less time fundraising, much more time meeting with constituents, studying public policy, focusing on the needs of the people we were elected to serve. We've seen an invigoration of local parties where candidates now come forward in places where there hadn't been a great depth of talent before. And we're able to focus on what we set out to do when we embarked on a career in public service, which is serving our communities, getting involved in public policy. It has been transformative in the way that it has changed the way that business is done in Connecticut. It has been a success. And also look at the fact that the proof is in the pudding. In Connecticut, we've now had public financing since 2008. And for years, the overwhelming majority of legislative and statewide candidates in Connecticut, members of both political parties, have chosen to participate in public financing for one simple reason. And that reason is it works. Thank you for listening and allowing me to testify. I'm happy to answer.
I have a question.
We'll take the questions in order if we don't mind.
We all have questions, apparently, for this nice man.
We appreciate your coming here from another state to tell us about your system.
All right, we're going to let Commissioner Galvin ask question first.
I was just wondering, in Connecticut, let's say, for example, there was no fusion voting and you had a challenge from a third-party candidate. Would that third-party candidate get the full limit? Would it increase the costs of your program?
In Connecticut, we have a barrier, viability barrier for participation in the program. So,
Qualifying metrics?
Yeah, so there are 2 different ways that you can qualify. So one looks at a party's performance in the last gubernatorial election. So to receive a full grant, so in Connecticut, we don't have the matching grant system that I know that New York has been looking at. We have a slightly different program. But in order to fully participate, it would only apply to parties that had 20% or more of the vote in the last election. And there's a smaller amount for 15% and 10%. I did listen with interest to a representative of the Green Party earlier talking about a Connecticut system. I would just note that the Green Party sued Connecticut, went to the Second Circuit, and lost that case trying to overturn our system. So it's interesting to hear them now embracing us as the way to go.
Thank you.
Question, do you have experience, could you tell us how many primaries there have been, to your knowledge, or again, experience, and Senator, again, I appreciate your coming here too, in Connecticut, on the minor party lines? In other words, for the minor party lines, primaries to get the minor party line. Does that happen?
So my understanding is Connecticut law allows minor parties to select how they endorse candidates. It opens the door to them having primaries. I am not aware of any minor party having a process for a primary as a way of selecting a candidate. They are allowed to pick candidates as they choose, and I don't think any of the minor parties in Connecticut currently do primaries.
My understanding, and you'll correct me, is that I think that as I studied the Connecticut law, the minor parties, either through a caucus system or a county committee or town committee system, select the candidates, and they can select candidates of other parties to be their nominee. But there doesn't seem to me, from my reading of Connecticut law, any process whereby a candidate not selected by the party per se is able to gain access to the ballot, because you must be a registered member of that party in order to go through the petitioning process that would then begin a primary. If you went against what it was that the caucus or the county committee, town committee, et cetera, might have authorized.
So with regard to, I think that's mostly correct. I would just sort of just amplify a little bit. With regard to the major parties, we do impose upon them a requirement that they have a primary process. That is a requirement that we put on major parties. I think on minor parties, we leave it up to the party rules. And so while they could elect to have a primary process, that is not something that we require minor parties to do.
And in practice, it's not done in Connecticut.
Correct.
That's right. Thank you.
Commissioner Nono?
Yeah, so with respect to, you mentioned that one way a candidate qualifies depends on the percentage of vote that candidate's party got in a prior gubernatorial election. And you said there was a second way in which a candidate can qualify. Can you explain that?
Yes, I mean this is something that has been the subject of litigation. This is there's no magic answer, but under the current law in Connecticut, there's a process for an independent candidate, a petitioning candidate, to get on the ballot. And the process that, as I understand it, is in place right now for them is they have to get a certain number of signatures. And if they get those signatures, I think it's 10% of the voters in the last election. So it's a pretty high signature threshold.
Then they qualify
then
for
they can qualify
a grant.
for the
And how's the grant determined?
But nobody's done that to my knowledge.
How's the grant determined then, generally?
Oh, so there's the grant is determined based. I mean, it's determined by an independent state agency and by statute, but based on whether the funding is sufficient to provide the full statutory authorized level. But it's pegged on what you need to run and win a competitive election.
Is that based upon prior, what has cost prior elections or prior candidates to run?
That's what we use to determine that level. So, you know, we have cheaper elections, I think, on the whole than you do. You're in a slightly more expensive media market, or a big chunk of the state is, and so, you know, things are cheaper, a little bit cheaper in Connecticut. But we looked at the cost of running a competitive election, and I've run now 6 times for the legislature, and 3 of my races were extremely competitive, targeted races, and I participate in the program at each of the times, as do most of my colleagues.
I want to make sure I heard you correctly. So for those candidates who didn't meet that threshold of the vote in the previous gubernatorial election, are they still entitled to some grant? And is it based? And then how is that percentage determined?
So this is you're talking about for minor parties, for a candidate who's only been endorsed by a minor party.
Yes.
As far as I know, no minor party candidate has ever qualified for a grant, because I don't know that anybody has done that. But the law says there's a test if you get 10%, if your party gets 10%, 15%, 20%.
Right, in the district that they're running now, right? I looked at your program too. So let's say the Working Families Party or the Kim Galvin Party received 20% in the last contested election. I think the grant might go up to 20% of the total amount that the major party candidate would get.
I believe that if the minor party received 20% of the vote in the previous election, and they were running a candidate, they were not cross-endorsed,
right.
They were running their own candidate as a separate candidate. If they reached that threshold, they could get the full grant amount that a major party candidate would get.
But if you are cross-endorsed, you only get the one limit, according to what you said.
That's right. So I was endorsed. I've been cross-endorsed repeatedly, and I've only gotten one grant. Well, I've received a primary grant and then a general grant. And the primary grant amount varies depending on whether or not it is what's called a party dominant district, whether or not the primary is considered tantamount to election. So we have a larger grant in places where the primary is really the critical race.
Thank you.
Commissioner Jacobs?
Yeah, I just had a question. You have these minor parties. In New York, there is a qualifying threshold that creates what we refer to, I guess, as permanent party status. So you have ballot status over the 4 years. How is it done in Connecticut?
We have the same system, so I don't exactly know how yours works, but we do have these parties that have been established as permanent minor parties. There's a threshold that they have to meet, and I don't exactly recall the
Ours is 50,000 votes in the last gubernatorial election, and then you have the status for 4 years, and then the next election shifts all the parties in the ballot order depending upon how many votes each individual party gets. So just for your own edification.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
very
much
much.
for coming.
So much.
We have John Riley from Warren County.
I have written statements, so I'll submit that. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things rather quickly. The big thing is that in a lot of parts of the state, campaigns are a little bit different. In our neighborhood, petition season, a lot of times, a lot of places, is you do it by car, and to get a dozen signatures may take you both a Saturday and a Sunday
Right.
to get to 12. It helps to have four-wheel drive vehicles because, driveways are long. It does snow in the spring. It does snow in May. So, there are expenses that are different. I think it's important to consider smaller races. That's where Assembly and Senate and congressional candidates come from. So the fact that we're leaving out city and town races is a critical error. I wanted to touch on the fusion ballot for a little bit. Fusion ballot enables a few individuals to have outsized influence over the electoral process. Small individuals, sometimes a single individual, can exert that pressure, and oftentimes that pressure is used not really to support a candidate, but to oppose another party. And it creates discord in the electoral process, especially in the smaller races. The last thing I wanted to touch on is I've worked elections since I was a kid, carrying 3x5 cards in the city of Albany. I'm now a Democrat in a heavily Republican area, so I understand that this goes both ways. But we really need to look at the numbers. Last year, I ran a campaign, a state Senate campaign, where the candidate raised and spent about $80,000 and was outspent 3-1. It didn't matter how much the incumbent spent in that race. $80,000 is not enough to be competitive in a rural area, and probably not in an urban area either. So we really have to be concerned about that number. Most of that money was raised within the district, and the match of 6-1 would have made that a competitive race. So whether it's a small local race or an inter-party race where somebody is challenging within their own party, the matching money is really important. I'll leave you my notes. You can contact me later, but thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much.
New York State Assembly Member Jake Ashby.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I didn't know I was signed up to speak, but I was happy to be here and listen. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, sorry about that. Like I said, good afternoon. I wasn't prepared to speak today, but I'm happy that I am up here, and I'm happy to see so many people coming out to discuss this important topic. I want to thank each and every one of you for providing the public with this opportunity. I have a hard time wrapping my head around publicly financed campaigns, and I was outspent 5-1 in my first election for Assembly. And then I was outspent 3-1.
He's very
Maybe
tall.
Yeah, you're tall.
The mic is
Maybe-
very low.
Can you take it out?
I'm sorry.
There you go.
That's it.
Better?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll hold the microphone.
There we go.
I was outspent 5-1 in my first campaign and 3-1, nearly 4-1 in my second campaign. So even with that, selfishly, I think about the opportunities that I would have as an elected official, an incumbent, really, coming into that. And, You know, I think it takes a balanced decision and a thought process to go through that, and I'm grateful that we have people to go through that and consider it. I wonder how balanced that decision making process will be based on where the appointed people on this committee are from, but I hope that they do their due diligence in considering this. It's interesting to see the ties to fusion voting in this process as well. I think that's something that the state has, to think about a lot. I'm grateful that we have a colleague from Connecticut to come in here and provide some insight into that. I know our processes are different, but it's good to have all the information at hand. I think the way that we're going about doing this requires a lot more thought and a lot more interaction between people than I think it's going to work out to be. I think having opportunities like this, we should really try and maximize this. I think we should increase the venue. I think we should increase the opportunity to hear everybody and get everybody's thoughts and opinions on it before coming to a decision. I know that sometimes that doesn't happen oftentimes with this administration, at least from my point of view, but I'm grateful to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sydney Morris. No. Robert Smith.
Good afternoon. My name is Rob
afternoon.
Smith. I am a lay community minister, means I'm not ordained, and I am here representing Interfaith Impact of New York State. We are deeply concerned about the inequitable campaign finance system that we have right now, and that the legislature has, in its wisdom, decided was going to correct finally after a couple of hundred years. But we all know that money walks the talk. Always has, probably always will in our lifetimes and our grandchildren and so on. The issue is that we can make the government more equitable by including more people in that process that walks the talk. And that's why we want matching funds. We believe that the more people who become involved in the democratic process, the more likely we are to have a government that actually responds to people's needs. We know through direct observation that big individual contributors are mostly likely looking for power and privilege. They're looking for big tax breaks. They want a piece of the Buffalo billions. They want contracts. They have very specific goals. The smaller donors, by and large, have more community interests. They want education for their kids, good streets, reliable infrastructure. You mentioned opioid addiction. We have very different approaches to opioid addiction. If you're big bucks, you want something that brings in big contracts, right? We don't want our kids going to jail. My neighbors want their kids back. And they want programs that will bring them back, and they want them adequately funded. And right now I don't hear candidates saying, we're going to adequately fund these programs. That's not what I'm hearing. Why? Because I don't think their voices are getting heard. So how big should the match be to walk that talk? 6, everybody is throwing out. I think it's a minimum. We could strongly recommend a higher figure. How about 10 or 16 times the donation? Why not? We could do that. Money walks the talk, and matching funds need to be high enough to get the votes of small donors heard. We are also concerned about the outrageously high campaign contribution limits for state office in New York. I'm recommending that you lower those too. Right now, I would say 25, 50, now you're getting there. 70%, 80% lowering of that contribution limit? Yes. So, thank you for hearing me.
Thank you.
Sir.
John Furman.
afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here, and thank you for offering the public an opportunity to speak. I live in Vernon, New York, upstate New York. I'm on the state committee for the Working Families Party and a proud board member of Citizen Action of New York. I've been with the WFP since the first day it was founded. So I have a number of statements from locally elected officials. I would like to read the commission, please. The first statement is from Michael Brown, who's a county legislator in Oneida County District 12. As a county elected official in Oneida County, I find it appalling that the commission, an unelected body, would have the temerity to tamper with the constitutionally protected right of fusion voting. It seems to me that the commission's goal should be to strengthen our democracy. Indeed, this could not be further from that ideal. This commission must enact a truly public financing system that must include at least a 6-to-1 match on small donations for both primary and general elections, as well as lower the allowed campaign donation to a reasonable level. Small donor matching funds is the strongest indicator of a robust democracy, and we must work to protect this basic tenet. This concept is our only protection against big money corporate funding of our democratic process. I trust that you will hold to your duty and protect our democratic ideals. This one is from Alan Cohen, Ward 1 in the city of Oneida. He's a council member. Fusion voting has been a part of our democratic system of government in New York State for 100 years and should remain for the next 1,000. Fusion voting does not take away the voices of activists with cross endorsements, but does allow for the cross endorsement of those candidates that support their views. With fusion voting, minor parties are free to endorse any candidate of their choice. Ending fusion voting ends this choice. We need to preserve our democratic principles and the New York State Constitution that gives the legislative body, not a commission, to change state laws. In addition to fusion voting, I support public financing of elections with a 6-to-1 match of small donor funds. It is time to give the average working person a greater voice in government. I fully support fusion voting remain the law of the land and the creation of a robust public financing system be implemented in New York. I have other statements from Roseanne Convertino, Oneida County Legislator, 22nd District, Jack Lomedico, and Frank DeBrango, who are council at large. And I implore you all to please keep our democracy alive by keeping fusion voting and public financing of elections.
Thank you so much.
God bless.
And if you could leave a copy of that for the record, that would be great. Thank you. Can you give it to this gentleman right here? Thank you.
Should we take a 5-minute break so we can go to lunch break or not?
I don't know that we can order it.
I just went to go to the bathroom. I have to go to the bathroom.
We're going to take a 5-minute break, please. Thank you. And then we should figure out.